Welcome to CIO Leadership Live. I'm Lee Rennick, Executive Director of CIO Communities for CIO.com, and I'm very excited and honored today to welcome and introduce Corey Jeffrey, Principal and VP Technology, Eyenovia. Corey, thanks so much for joining us today on the show. Could you please introduce yourself and maybe tell us a little bit more, about your current role?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Lee. I'm Corey. Like you said, I'm a principal and VP technology at Eyenovia. Eyenovia is a full stack venture capital investment firm headquartered in Canada. Full stack just meaning we invest as early as company formation all the way through to pre-IPO. It's been around about 20 years, one of the largest VC firms in the country. At Eyenovia, I wear two hats. One hat is the principal hat, and that means I do early stage tech investing. So for me, particularly, that's sort of the company formation to Series B, where I focus mostly on practical applications of artificial intelligence, companies like Cohere, Spellbook, Reliant, BenchIQ, and others that I've been involved with. And then I also wear a hat, which is a VP of technology, where I work in the CTO office, where that's across the entire portfolio company. So that's working with companies who are very small or very, very large and helping them build world-class tech and product organizations.
Well, I thank you so much for telling us a bit about who you are and what you do, and I really appreciate you joining us. I know you're working with companies like Cohere, and they just made a big announcement with RBC, which is amazing.
Yeah.
So congrats for that. And just, sharing about your role. I think it'll be really informative for our listeners who are listening in today. And I really appreciate you joining us, Corey. So as mentioned, we've really developed this series to support the technology leader and CIO in their tech and leadership journey. And so the first question, and I ask everyone this question on the show, could you please tell me a little bit perhaps about your own career path and leadership journey to date? Any lessons learned along the way that you could share with our audience?
Yeah, sure. So I like to describe my career as sort of like sitting in the back of a moving truck looking backwards, in that it's not super intentional. I actually started my career academically in studying English literature and philosophy, epistemology, and metaphysics. I was actually on my way to do my PhD in metaphysics when a guy named Ian Klugman from Communitech pulled me aside and said, "Hey, why don't you come and help run this startup technology accelerator with me and a couple other people?" And I said, "I don't know anything about that." And he said, "Oh, you're smart. You'll figure it out." And so that got me into the startup world, where I spent 2 years investing in companies. And this was at the time when Y Combinator had just started. So it was like this accelerator boom. Through that, I learned all about technology, fell in love with products, started becoming technical. I was then introduced to Steve Woods, who ran engineering in Canada for Google, and was recruited to join Google, where I spent the better part of a decade. Did a couple things. So I ran developer relations in Canada. So that was, running developer communities, launching developer products, things like that. I then spent a bunch of time in emerging markets where the next billion users were coming onto the internet, Indonesia, India, Brazil, and got to understand what markets that were who had skipped the desktop revolution and went straight to mobile, how they were coming online and how they were building products. And then I started having kids. That was around 2016. And so it was time to have more of a local role than spending, I think in 2016, I spent 100 days on an airplane out of country and almost ran into tax problems, actually. So then I switched over to be the chief of staff of engineering for Canada, where I helped grow the engineering organization in Canada for Google from about 200 when I started to just over 2,000 when I left, across all sorts of different product areas, research areas, all of the things. The Transformer paper was published when I was there. We got to see that go through first party products, work a little bit with Jeff Hinton's team, all of those sorts of things. I would say a major lesson through all of that is that it's all about people. You can do some really amazing, hard, inspiring things with great people and have it feel fun and not easy, but invigorating. And you can do some really easy things that feel absolutely terrible with crappy people. And so, trust matters, people matter, investing in people matters. So when past mentors of mine, Steve Woods being one of them, who I had mentioned, and then another guy named Patrick Bichette, who is the CFO at Google. When I started there, they came and pitched me Inovia, and I followed that and took that opportunity to work with some great people that I'd worked with in the past.
Well, that's a really amazing career. And I mean, I think just that initial state where you were learning and you were learning in different spaces and areas, right, contribute to like that idea of continuous learning and not always perhaps looking at the straight technology aspect of it, especially, I volunteer at HackerGal. They're an organization that supports young girls learning about technology, right? And they're getting away from, perhaps that idea of it just being about engineering and going and getting the engineering degree. So I love that approach you took into the business and sort of the stuff you studied that was very different to what you did, but it contributed to it. And then, of course, the idea of people, a lot of the CIOs I'm speaking with right now are talking about obviously generative AI, which we're going to talk about, but agentic AI and how that's going to fit in to learning and people and how they'll upskill their team. So I really, really appreciate you joining us here today, Corey, and thanks so much for sharing. All right, so one of the reasons why I wanted you to be on the show was I'm really interested in learning about your role at Inovia and really around the evaluation of tech investment. I mean, with Gen AI, data, cloud, and security really being at the forefront of the minds of so many CIOs I speak with, where do you see like a CIO or a tech leader, where do you see they might need to think about investing to ensure, they're really bringing those technologies into their company, really enhancing productivity and business value?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And I spend a lot of time doing due diligence on tech companies in various stages. What they're missing often is dependent on the stage they're in, right? Levels of sophistication and how early versus later you are. But there's a lot of themes. And so we sort of break it down into 4 buckets. The first is always, and this is in order of importance in my view. The first is always people. And we talked a little bit about that, and I'll dive into it a little more. Then it's product and product thinking. And then it's your engineering practice. And then it's technology. Like, what are you actually using, building, the how? And so in the first case, I mean, it seems like an obvious one, but you can't have a high performing engineering team and ride a wave of a new technology well if you don't have great people. And this is a little ironic because a lot of the conversation is around a world where everyone's talking about automating away your need for more knowledge workers, right? And so there's a bit of a dichotomy here, right?
Yeah.
But the thing that's true is there's a guy on my team named Noah who's wonderfully smart, and he's always like, look, 20 years ago, if your doctor told you, they didn't have a smartphone, you might have been okay with that. If your doctor told you that today, you would not be okay, right? If your doctor said, I don't use the internet, you would be, you wouldn't want to have that doctor, right? And the argument here is, the top 10% of your workers are going to get exponentially better, and your middle and lower workers those are the ones that get phased out over time. So it's not AI taking your job, it's someone using AI, right? That'll get the lift. So it means that having your top performers, and we've always talked about these in my career as drivers, having drivers within your organization is more critical now than it has ever been. And drivers are those people who, it doesn't matter whose team they're on, if they see a problem, they just have to fix it. And when they move to fix it, they bring people together to get things done across organizations, and they act as a force multiplier, right? And you could probably think in your career of like someone who just everything they touched, and it had these ripple effects, right? These people are absolutely worth their weight in gold. And at a moment where everything is in flux and everything's moving around, if you don't have these people in your organization, you need them now more than ever. So a lot of our time is spent evaluating whether or not companies have drivers, and then for those that we've invested in helping them make sure they get drivers in key areas and empowering them to do things. So that's number one. The other big one is product thinking is actually extremely rare. And so if you think about product thinking, it's a combination of like strategic insight, user empathy, and executional excellence, right? Great product leaders, in my experience, even within large organizations, sort of function as mini CEOs.
Right.
And the fact that they work across everything, right? And bring people together. And a lot of time companies have pieces of the product puzzle, but miss the other pieces. And often those pieces that they miss fall into archetypal gaps. And I'll let you know what I mean a little bit about that. So one is like, you have a company, maybe they pride themselves on being extremely scrappy, right? So they're really quick at iterating and experimenting and getting things out, but they fall so much into that, like, let's just try another thing, that they miss that sort of strategic insight and miss when to go deep, right? So that's one archetype. The other is a deeply technical company that cares quite a lot about the system they're building, and the classic, like, fall in love with the technology. And the bold sort of truth is nobody gives a shit what technology you're using. They care about the functionality that you provide as an outcome.
Right.
And so those companies often miss having customer empathy, right? And so they miss that in the product thinking. And then you have the classic sales-led company where the product organization is sort of beleaguered by the 50 things that they need to do and change their roadmap on consistently.
Yeah.
And when that happens, like, obviously changing your roadmap based on customer feedback makes a lot of sense. But if you do it too often, you miss being strategic at all, because now you're reacting all the time versus having a market view. So a lot of the time we spend a lot of time, common advice on drivers, and then filling the product thinking gap so that you can actually be strategic, empathetic, and execute against a product goal. And then you get into how you build it. And then to me, that matters actually less.
Yeah. But the drivers are really interesting. I mean, so it sounds like you're really wanting to make sure those people that are, like you said, creating across the company, looking at that, understanding that. And, I've owned a couple of businesses. I know, usually people who are entrepreneurs have more of that mindset, perhaps. So that's really interesting that to me, it seems like an entrepreneurial mindset. And maybe that's not how you envision it, but it does to me, just reflecting on my own time in my own business and how I had to sort of understand various bits and pieces of the organization to drive it forward. I think that's really interesting. And then I was just reflecting when you were talking about like how you're building the technology and the customer centric aspect of it, and understanding that, I was just talking to a CIO this past week about how she changed vendors, for her data and her cloud, and how that was such a big heavy lift from a leadership perspective. Like, she could get nowhere close to the end user engagement with the product, because just the fact that she had to deal with this change in vendor and all of the sort of politics that went around it really took her away from that. And I just had that call and discussion yesterday, and and I thought that was interesting too, given that there's such a huge remit and a leadership role for people who are leading technology, that they get pulled away perhaps from those aspects. And I guess that would be something you would identify when you go in.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And one of the things that I think about a lot, because look, you're running a big org, you have a bunch of things to do. The things on fire always take precedent. And then also, there's the the bureaucratic cruff that just takes up time, right? And so a lot of what in my career, what I've seen work is we used to run what's called a 70-20-10 model. And so across all those thousands of engineers at Google in Canada, Steve and I were really, really specific about, okay, 70% of everybody's time should be on core product, right? Like, trains on time, we've got commitments, we make our commitments. That's our reputation within the company. And that's table stakes. 20% of people's time should be on the edge of those core products. So innovation on the edge of those products. There's always things that you wish you could do, but maybe you need to do more, technical debt. But no, you got to actually make sure that en masse, 20% of the time you're moving something innovative forward. And then 10% of your time is on something that's unrelated and so crazy that it's definitely not going to work. But if it does work, this is a real game changer for the business, right? And so as an organizational leader, like, it's not 70-20-10 per like a person's time, it's across your org. And so you really need to protect that experimental time in order to allow like that vendor problem to not become everything, right? So you still have pieces of your organization that are innovating, that are using new tools, that are whatever it is you need to do. Otherwise, you'll just always get stuck in
I think it's a
replatforming.
great model. I thank you so much for sharing it. I mean, that's really, I just want to keep having this conversation because I'm thinking of things that I've been involved in that I've spent, some time in looking at it, looking at how we could adopt it, or maybe looking at how a client might want it. They don't want it, but then maybe 3 or 4 years later or two, like COVID hit and we were all online, right?
Yep,
As one
totally.
CIO told me, his online ordering went up by 45,000% or something. You couldn't
It's
not deal with
wild.
it. But if you've already
Yeah.
been in an experimental stage, whether it
Mhm.
worked or not, there'll be some learnings around that, which will be really, it's like you're investing in your company without really knowing it almost, right?
Totally. And it's how you train drivers too, right? Because your
Yeah.
drivers are people who get their work done and then are looking for other things. So you give them that thing, you give them somebody who has the potential, right, to work alongside them. And then that's how you train the next thing. And then they spin off and do something else, right? And it's a great methodology for your innovation, but also on your investing in employees so that they don't find their next opportunity somewhere
Yeah.
else.
I love that. I love that advice. Thank you. Okay. We're talking a little bit about it, excuse me, already, but just around structuring teams and talent. So we've talked a little bit about that, some of the ways you invest in your employees, to make sure that, like you said, they want to stick around because you are doing that work that's really exciting for them. So, but, for the CIOs listening in or the tech leaders, I want to talk a little bit about roadmaps for business and the types of things they should maybe look at around structuring and upskilling tech teams, especially with LLMs and Gen AI. I was just talking to our head of research, and what they're finding from some of our research is that this agentic AI is a piece that now will probably fall into some training with teams and upskilling and that type of thing. So I would love to really understand a bit more of your insights on the people, the team building, and the tech building and planning.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those interesting questions where it's how far do you go into the new thing, right? And one of the things that I think people who have worked a lot with, whether directly with models or model-based tools, LLMs, um, it's not a panacea of an answer for everything, right? It's a it's a hammer. It's a new hammer that you put in your tool belt and use where appropriate. Um, and right now, people are hitting a lot of nails with it, or things that look like nails, and not everything's a nail. And so that's a tough part for CIOs and other people to look at and be like, well, where am I actually getting value here for the investment, right? Um, and so a lot of the conversations we've been having and that we talk to our portfolio companies about is you take an approach where which part of your core value proposition, whether this is on like your internal infrastructure side or on your product side or whatever it is, what of that is do you think is going to be commoditized, right? Like what of that can be handed to an LLM and eventually it's going to get sophisticated enough, and then what do you add that's like special and core, and you want to focus your efforts around the core stuff, and then have a build versus buy decision and use tools for the things that you don't need to be doing anymore so that you can go quickly. um, when you do that, we see a lot of people, one of the traps I think that will play out over time for companies, we see a lot of people get into what I call gross margin optimization, which is like knowledge workers output more work more quickly using LLM based tools. Think tools like internal search or velocity of code output or increase your ability to review contracts or just stuff like that, right? This is great and you need to do all of this stuff, but it's sort of table stakes. And the way that I think about it is like there's 50 startups who are coming straight at your value proposition
Right.
in a garage somewhere,
Right.
and they are moving way faster than they were 2 years ago
Mm.
because of all of the technology that's available to them. And there's a competitor of yours who's doing something completely different on a product side, who's focused on the customer experience than they were doing it 2 years ago. And so if all you're doing is looking internally at your operations, you're probably missing a piece of the puzzle that could cost you quite a bit. And so you don't want to get stuck in that sort of navel gazing. So that's
Well,
one piece of it.
yeah,
Sorry, go
that's
ahead.
really interesting. I like that. And I like the fact that you're talking about other companies that are right in their garage doing things faster. So they're going to get out to market quicker. And, I'm seeing it myself, right? All the pitching I'm getting in my inbox now. And I'm like, who is real and who isn't,
Yep,
right?
totally. And I feel for all the people in these roles because startups are able to throw whatever at experimentation. because they don't have the burden of, systems that they need to maintain, and customers that the SLOs that they have to withhold, and all those things hold up. But the thing that you can do as a CIO is, like, back to the experimentation piece, is like, you need to be your 10%. You need to be working at it really hard. You need to have your best people figuring out what the actual use cases are that matter to you, and on the product side. And one of the things that I also would say is, like, okay, so before I do that, tactically, the way that we've had these set up in the past is you take an executive leader who is leaned in, you take a product person, a business function knower, they might be in marketing or sales or wherever, I don't know, depends on your organization. And you take a couple engineers, these are your drivers, and you just start building things, right? Like, actually start building things. Because you can ask yourself, how do I make sure that the next thing I get through my RFP process adds the most amount of value? But this changes so quickly that it's actually worth more for you to be upskilling your people by getting them doing things hands-on, right? Yeah. Like, that's what you need. And then that can proliferate the organization. Another way to bootstrap this that we used to do is, you are not going to learn from the person who's been sitting in your organization for 15 years, is your senior developer, and is like totally, what do you call it, institutionalized in your build systems and the way that you work. Like, they're great employees. I'm not saying you shouldn't have those employees. I'm saying they're not the ones who are going to see how development is going to change. Yeah. Right. That's not the lens, unless they're super curious and they spend all their time at night doing things externally. So have interns. Like, again, sounds simple. We used to always have, across our offices in Canada, 13% of the offices were interns, always, all year. And so that does a couple magical things. One, it pushes the bottom of your organization, right? It teaches your organization how to teach, right? Yeah. Which means you hold your standards. If you're going to have an intern, you have to know how things are supposed to work. Yeah. And one of the risks of these LLMs and coding is that you take your worst people and make them 10 times more efficient at crap, right? Right. Right. And then also, it's the 21-year-old developer coming out of the University of Waterloo, who's going to teach you how people build things today. Right. And it might not, I'm not saying you need to throw all your stuff away and like build like them, but that's the insight, the energy that you need to look at, that you can then compare that to what you do, and take the best parts of it and now move that across your organization. Yeah, I love it. And you're reminding me of my consulting days. We used to take people through Google design sprints, Yeah. Just do it in a week. It's like, come on together. That everyone would be freaked out. They're like, what are we doing? We can't do that. I'm like, well, we can actually. Let's write it down. We used to, our office wall was a big board you could write on, and we would just take them through it. And at the end, we'd have a little mini product. And it was really nice to see people get out of, like, as you said, that they're in a box or doing something a certain way, but to get out of it and think in a different way. And, with a lot of resistance and probably a lot of coffee, we'd get through to where we needed to go. So I really appreciate you sharing that. So final question here, we've been talking about this a lot, but just, a lot of IT leaders have been saying, like, Gen AI, we're using it to build productivity. I was at the CIO 100 in the US last year, and there were a lot of great use cases around this, right? And they said, we are bringing value to the business because we're doing things 200% faster here. So now we can take some of this team and move them over here and have them learning about, the next adoption stage, perhaps, of AI. IDC just put out some research. They predicted that, the AI pivot to build that AI fueled business model will be pretty strong in 25 and continue into 26. Would love to hear your thoughts on this. We're still in January, we're just almost at the last day of January here doing this interview, but any predictions for 2025? Yeah, I mean, that's the great thing about being a VC, is you always get to make predictions and put a little bit of money behind it and see if it pans out. Steve and I, Steve's a partner of mine at Inovia, we wrote a white paper in 2024, which had a bunch of predictions in it. And we did okay, I would say, on how that panned out to date, and then very wrong in some other cases. But I think that 2025 is sort of the year of what we would call being clever, right? So you've kind of moved away from well, actually DeepSeek has pulled this conversation into the mainstream, I think. But there's this, you know, all the compute in the world, maximalism to get to the next breakthrough mentality that I think DeepSeek has called into question. There's a lot of other companies. Cohere is another one of these companies that is focused on usefulness, data security, and outcomes. But I think there's a shift in 2025, which is that you're going to see more and more market attention around what is this good for versus some sort of end state of AGI, whatever that means, right? Which I think is helpful because a lot of the benchmarks that you see and that people evaluate technology on are mostly useless. And I think a lot of the CIOs would agree it's the internal benchmarks of your use case that are actually helpful versus like some abstract, benchmark against some generic reasoning. So I think we're going to get more specific, which means you're going to get more verticalized in the models. You're going to have hyper focus and verticalization. I think those with a focus on security and data security and trust and transparency will do a lot better. I think in particular in the enterprise, there was early adoption in what I would say toy applications, but now these sort of deep embedded applications take time, right? And this is sort of one of those Cohere RBC things that we were talking about earlier. I also think that a lot of the big companies that are successful here have a surprising amount of service attached to them because of the hand-holding that's needed here for implementation of AI. I think off-the-shelf, one-size-fit-all tools work for consumer and SMB and don't really work for the enterprise.
Yeah.
So I think you'll see more of that. And I think companies who do a good job at the services side are going to win overall. I think you're going to see a lot of emergence in LLM stuff as we've been seeing that goes beyond like a chat interface, right? We've seen a lot of interesting stuff in geospatial and synthetic data creation and simulation. The hearts and minds were captured with ChatGPT, but this technology is much, much broader than that. And then lastly, I would just say like reasoning, right? These are not reasoning in the computer science reasoning, not reasoning like these things are sentient, is a fundamentally different technology than like what a one-shot ChatGPT does with transformers. And so, reinforcement learning is an example of something else you need. And so if one of the things that DeepSeek sort of brought the attention to was that, there's now going to be 1,000 RL researchers who are going to spend their time on the intersection of reinforcement learning and transformers because of the progress that it seems to be make. And so getting that reasoning into the hands of people at the application layer is going to be incredibly interesting. And O3 is a OpenAI model that will take this a step further as well, I think. So I think in 2025, we're going to see, when people say agentic, everyone's like, well, what the hell is agentic mean, right? It's kind of like when someone says Web3, you're like, well, I don't know. Like, what does that mean, right? But for me, it's just like something that has a plan and does multi-step processes. I think you're going to start to see actual applications of that working at a commercial level, whereas today I think most of it is toys. So that'll be interesting.
Wow, what great insights. Thanks so much. I'm really looking forward to hosting you on a panel at the Future IT in Toronto in end of April, early May. That'll be really great to continue the discussion. Corey, thank you so much for joining me today. I've really appreciated it.
No worries. Thanks for having me, Lee.
Thanks again. And if you're looking to listen to this or other interviews, head on over to CIO.com. Thanks again.